can agree that was the best ever introduction. Thank you. Today, I want to invite you to consider those great countries of the imagination that we inhabit when we get lost in a book, and what happens to us when we spend part of our lives there. I've earlier argued that the psychological and social benefits of immersion reading include increased empathy, which is a somewhat different claim about the sources of narrative empathy than those that emphasize specifically literary texts or the effects of reading canonical literature. An immersed reader can get lost in a book that isn't dignified by a canon of critical approval or the badges of literariness. The metaphor for reading that I've been using, lost in a book, calls up the idea of imaginative transportation, which is one way of thinking about immersion. To the immersed reader, the experience may feel like getting away, but it doesn't actually feel like being lost. I travel in my mind with Lyra to the place in Svalbard where the armored bears live. I stand with Jay Gatsby looking across the water at the green light marking the end of Daisy Buchanan's dock. I think you've been there too. I return to London between the wars, where I never was in real life, when I reread Mrs. Dalloway. I walk with Leopold Bloom through the familiar streets of 1904 Dublin on a June day, in the company of the exiled James Joyce, who invented his Dublin of the mind from far away in time and distance. Imaginative transportation endows the reader with astonishing superpowers. We need no translator to speak the local lingo. We can see into the minds of our companions, and the narrator will carry us through to the end of our journey, even if we are bewildered by strange and unfamiliar beings along the way. A rereader is especially empowered by getting lost in a book. Once I go through that wardrobe in the spare room, I know how to find Mr. Tumnus, and I can see in my mind's eye the beaver dam and the snowy wood and the way to the White Witch's castle. And I'm not alone. A reader lost in a book has thousands or even millions of companions, and it's easier than ever to share the pleasure of reading with them. I include, for the sake of a younger generation of readers that we are meeting already in our classrooms, companions in reading who may not be wedded to the print page. The traditional modes of reading have opened up to embrace new platforms and hybrid forms, and we are still in the early stages of the process of discovering the affordances and liabilities of these devices and documenting the changes in reading practices that they invite. Today, I'd like to use my time with you to open up several questions that continue to interest me, questions that arise out of my earlier work on narrative empathy, questions that our colleagues in cognitive science, social and developmental psychology, and neuroscience have been helping us investigate. I agree with Keith Oatley that the collaborative and cross-disciplinary work on the psychology of fiction point towards a future in which, rather than accepting assertions from literary theory that seem plausible, these assertions can be investigated so that we know better what readers actually make of poems and stories and what writers are doing when they write them. This gathering provides a great opportunity for sharing ideas, so I plan to leave ample time for us to converse, and this talk should take just under 40 minutes. All of the questions that I raise rest on the premise that immersion reading and experiences of narrative empathy are at the very least strongly correlated, as studies by Marr and Oatley, Ball and Veldkamp, Zwan, and my colleague Dan Johnson suggest. Though, as many of you know, I still require convincing that these experiences of narrative empathy lead inexorably to good world citizenship, in Martha Nussbaum's terms, or to increased altruism in the real world, I am persuaded that the strategic narrative empathy of authors can, in the most favorable circumstances, reach readers both inside and outside the tribe, at least in the short term, widen the empathetic circle, reduce bias, increase a sense of belonging, render the unfamiliar less strange, shift beliefs, and alter attitudes. Those are significant impacts by any measure, and they stem from the value system of the humanities. They're on my list today because they have been validated by social scientific research as well as by our introspection. My questions will open up areas that have been less studied or where we have only the early results of new research programs. I ask, why might immersion reading of fiction invite higher levels of narrative empathy than other kinds of reading? And how important is the modality of reading to both immersion and empathy? How does our reading experience change when we shift from the codex to the e-reader to the interactive screen? In addressing both these questions, I will be drawing attention to important work that Anne Mangan and Don Kuiken recently published in Scientific Study of Literature, a journal that I commend to your attention. Before I dive into these questions, let me set out my stall with some definitions so that you will know how I am using the key terms empathy and immersion in what follows. Human empathy encompasses many phenomena, ranging from emotional contagion and motor mimicry, role-taking and perspective-taking, and emotional fusion, all the way to empathic concern. Not all human empathy leads to expressions of sympathy and altruistic action, for the aversive response called personal distress in the psychological literature is also an empathic phenomenon. It can involve sharing feelings with inanimate objects. Indeed, the early theories of Einfühlung began there. One important form of empathy, fantasy empathy, describes sensations of shared feeling and perspective with those special effects of the inanimate objects that we call works of fiction. From marks on the page, readers co-create fictional characters that can evoke intensities of emotional fusion, the shock of recognition, and the attentional investment that we call character identification. This is a version of narrative empathy, but not the only one. Narrative empathy is different from real-life empathy because we feel it in response to a story rather than having a here-and-now reaction to another living creature in the real world. Yet it can feel just as intense when we share feelings in narrative empathy. As I've earlier defined it, narrative empathy involves the sharing of feeling, matched-up feelings, and perspective-taking brought about by reading, viewing, hearing about, or even imagining stories of another's situation or condition. Authors experience it, which is part of why I included imagining. Narrative empathy plays a role in the aesthetics of production when writers feel it in the process of creating fiction. Marjorie Taylor's studies of fiction writers have shown that successful fiction writers, those who can make a living by their work, score very high on empathy scales. They experience the illusion that their fictional creations possess independent agency, so when they feel with their characters, it is as if they were feeling with beings separate from themselves. This consequence of high empathy and an imaginative disposition may help in the creation of characters that evoke empathy in readers. Something lifelike is breathed into them through authors' empathy, even if they are unrealistic, fantastical characters. For readers, empathy appears to play a role in mental simulation of fictional worlds that readers perform when they co-create those worlds imaginatively. The aesthetics of literary response involves feelings evoked by techniques writers use to cue the world creation of fiction reading, a lot of which entails filling in gaps. If you have ever had a reading or viewing experience where you felt that you shared the sensations, feelings, thoughts, and experiences, sometimes invited by sharing identity and circumstance of a fictional character, then you have known narrative empathy. Many philosophers and novelists have advocated novel reading as a good way of practicing perspective-taking or a thinking form of empathy, but this is just the beginning of the potential effects. Unreal worlds can have a profound influence on us. Look at the generation of readers that J.K. Rowling gave us, willing to read big, long novels for fun. George Eliot, who wrote some real whoppers herself, thought that a major purpose of her work was to cultivate her readers' sympathetic imagination. And there's good evidence that novel reading can alter readers' beliefs and attitudes. Furthermore, the deeper the immersion and the stronger the empathetic connection to fictional beings, the greater the chance of a reader's prosocial responding to actual people or engaging in the personally costly helping behavior that we call altruism. At the earlier session for teachers, I shared research done by my Washington and Lee colleague, psychology professor Dan Johnson, and his students, suggesting that mental visualizing may have a greater immediate empathic impact than thinking exercises designed to put oneself in the shoes of another. Dan Johnson's research has shown that readers who are given exercises in mental visualizing before reading fiction in controlled laboratory circumstances do experience a greater degree of immersion in fictional worlds. That is, in comparison to a group given perspective-taking instructions, this is put yourself in the shoes of another. Johnson found that the readers in the mental visualizing condition more readily immersed in fictional worlds. But that's not all. They also showed increases in empathic reactions and increased helping behavior. The reason this research matters to a literary critic is that it suggests a kind of reading, the immersion reading supported by strong mental visualizing, looks rather more valuable than escapist, more improving than lazy. Maybe we should be encouraging people to get lost in a book. Mental visualizing, or seeing with the mind's eye, is an important component of immersion reading, along with losing track of time, forgetting or blocking out the real world in which the reader exists temporarily in favor of a wrought world. Immersion reading requires not just literacy, but fluency. It means the ability to call up a visual image in your mind's eye, although one could also have spatial imagining mediated through what we think are the same structures in the brain. We do it when we are remembering, planning, hearing, or reading fiction. Just like empathy, which some people feel more strongly than others, mental visualizing ability is stronger in some people than in others, and many highly intelligent, successful people have weak mental visualizing skills. Just this past week, a contributor to a narratology listserv that I read confessed that as a younger reader, long visual descriptions in novels used to make him anxious because he had read that readers were supposed to form mental pictures in their heads, and he never felt like he was doing it right. And I'm confident that in this group there are some people present who just are not strong mental visualizers, and there's nothing wrong with that. It's just one of the human differences that we have from one another. Normally, in a group this size, a few people will be very strong mental visualizers with vivid pictures of places not present to you, and as I said, a few others will not be able to see anything at all in your mind's eye. This faculty may have an impact on the way we co-create fictional worlds, and it almost certainly maps onto our preferences for certain kinds of reading. It's probably not an accident that I have spent a lifetime submerged in fictional worlds, that I score high on fantasy empathy scales, and that I am prone to vivid daydreaming. And I can remember scenes and spaces from the past with visual and dimensional richness. But which of these traits is a matter of disposition or habit or training? We need to take care in our claims that we make about causation as we defend the humanities. Certainly, we would want to investigate the premise that reading image-rich literature may be one of the ways that we can cultivate a habit of mental visualizing and ease the way to immersion, but I wouldn't want to assume that low mental visualizers are also low empathy individuals. In fact, I think is obviously not the case. Immersion, as I have been referring to it loosely here, has been described by researchers using a bunch of different terms. Victor Nell, the granddaddy of researchers on readers who get lost in a book, referred to it as entrancement and considered it a variety of flow. Richard Garrick's preferred term is transportation, in which the reader is like a traveler, temporarily engrossed in the story world. Marie-Laure Ryan, in her pioneering work on narrative as virtual reality, used immersion to describe the illusion of readers' bodily projection into the fictional world. Others have used the language of engagement, absorption, and presence to refer to the readerly illusion of entering a story world. And these are all slightly different things, so I'm parsing that loosely. Common features of these slightly differing labels include empathy with characters and mental visualizing of plot actions and story spaces. Every generation of readers will have some who are readier to immerse in fictional worlds from the cues of prose than others. A question for humanities educators concerns whether we can intervene effectively in encouraging mental visualizing. Some scholars think that today's young people are less adept as a generation in mental visualizing than those of us who grew up without the vivid fictional worlds of video games visualized for us in three-dimensional color. But I'm not certain that's true. In fact, it may be that those immersion gamers bring a higher expectation of vividness and emotional intensity to their encounters with textual worlds. Why should we care about this question, and should it have a place in our conversations about liberal education? Well, let's say that our students do prize immersion, and that some of them find it more effortful to achieve in reading print literature. Can we meet them halfway, or do our abjuring gestures get in the way? In our efforts to teach time-honored values of high literary style, do we denigrate the very texts that are most likely to invite immersion because they do not live up to our standards of value? If we become certain that some of the challenges of reading difficult literary texts, for example, gap-filling imagining and inferences about characters' motives, just don't occur in more popular and accessible texts, well, that would give me pause. But as a narrative theorist, I think we would be hard-pressed to demonstrate such categorical differences in technique and experience. We really should set aside the ranking system that places some subgenres low and others high. As a reader of the psychological literature, I am encouraged by discoveries such as those made by Fong, Mullen, and Marr about popular subgenres of fiction. You heard about this research earlier today. They found that after controlling for personality, gender, age, and English fluency, exposure to romance novels and to a lesser degree suspenseful thrillers significantly predicted interpersonal sensitivity, results they did not find for either domestic realism or science fiction. Genres that, quote, highlight interpersonal relationships appear to be particularly relevant for outcomes associated with social ability, they conclude. Interesting. Romance novels, the most common target for critical denigration. So if you're reading the philosophy that takes up questions of the ethics of reading, the most typical gesture made by, like Jennifer Robinson would be an example in her book, Deeper Than Reason. She'll be generalizing about all these wonderful things that might happen to you if you read, in her case it would be Edith Wharton. She reads extensively. And as she's generalizing about these wonderful effects that you get from reading The Reef, great novel, she has to sort of make a snarky remark about romance novels. But it's not going to work if it's just romance novels. Romance novels are just automatic. Like the things that are going on in romance novels don't count. And so this is a very habitual gesture on the part of many literary scholars and philosophers to sort of set aside or brush aside real reading of real people. And I would point out that romance novels are especially important to us because we think about 75 to 80% of the actual avocational readers, people who choose to read, happen to be women. So what they read actually should matter to us. And I think we should try to figure out what's happening to us when readers like us are transported into a fictional world with attention to its genre, embrace the experience of escapism, and set aside our prohibitions and denigrations in favor of a closer examination of immersion. When we lose track of time, is that a bad sign, or does that mean that immersion reading is a form of flow? I find being in a fictional world, even one full of violence and vengeance, a mentally refreshing exercise. I also feel as if I make friends when I read, especially reading characters. My own experiences of immersion reading have almost certainly been among the most pleasurable and influential practices of 45 of my 52 years. Immersion reading made me who I am, with a head full of alternative worlds and an eclectic community of characters that I know better than some of the people I see every day. Getting lost in a book makes me smarter, more alert to the experiences of others, and it helps me build a sense of self as connected to inhabitants of other times and spaces. Now, to the outside observer of an immersed reader, things look rather different. The person with her nose in a book looks not like a traveler, an adventurer, a world co-creator, rather an ignorer of others, a shutter-out, an antisocial being, maybe even a self-endangering fool, if she has a habit of walking around while reading, as I did on the uneven sidewalks of my childhood home. Immersed is a polite word for how this behavior seems to others. My little sisters could barely tolerate it. They would put their hands over the page. They were right, I was ignoring them. As a form of escapism, immersion reading is considered socially acceptable only if you are on vacation. Immersion reading looks awfully lazy. Even English professors are understood to be reading hard books, the kind of works that require decoding and lots of marginal note-taking, and reference books close at hand. Immersion reading is generally understood to be easy reading, and that's not good. No pain, no gain. Immersion reading does not fit readily into our regimens of self-improvement. There's too much pleasure in it. It seems suspect, like a mood-enhancing drug. It wastes time. Several centuries ago, it was roundly criticized as taking readers away from their Bibles, and that constituency of critics is still out there, worrying about the baleful influence of Harry Potter on a generation of children. A particular concern lies in frivolous expenditures of feeling. This critique goes all the way back to St. Augustine. What are we doing, wasting our real feelings on the imaginary fates of made-up beings? What happens to readers when they get lost in a book, and what might happen afterwards when we surface and come back to the real world? Should a liberal education encourage immersion reading, given those critiques? I think it should, right alongside critical thinking, with the understanding that the critical analytical practices we tend to emphasize in the humanities classroom are not threatened by interludes of submerging in alternative fictional worlds. This leads me, at last, to my first question. Why might immersion reading of fiction invite higher levels of narrative empathy than other kinds of reading, or even with people in real life? I think that some people find it easier to share feelings with fictional characters than with real-life individuals, in part because our fiction reading doesn't demand anything of us. We can let our caution and skepticism relax when we read fiction. It doesn't matter if we are fooled by it, because we go into the experience knowing that it's unreal. I've hypothesized that the no-strings-attached expectation invoked by the paratextual label fiction releases the reader to make empathetic connections without fear that they will be required to reciprocate, make commitments, or act in the real world. Apple and Malakars hypothesized that the conditions set by paratexts trigger different needs. Paratexts are those labels that tell you what the thing is before you get into it. A need for cognition in reading nonfiction, and a need for affect when reading fiction. And that's an interesting idea. They think that readers expect to be transported more into fictional worlds, and therefore they are. Story labels, they suggest, affect transportation, which is their word for immersion. I want to underscore that this is a different question than the one asked by studies comparing the empathetic dispositions of fiction readers and nonfiction readers. That is, it's not a surprise to find high fantasy empathy individuals among voluntary novel readers and lower empathy results among nonfiction factual readers, but that contrast in itself does not argue for a causal relationship arising from the genre of the reading, although there is some research about effects of reading that we should attend to. Furthermore, subgenres of nonfiction focused on the perspectives of human agents, including memoir, testimonio, and biography, may attract or form higher empathy readers than drier, more factual, and overtly argumentative or analytical forms of nonfiction. That comparative work has simply yet to be done. Ulrika Altman and her collaborators performed a neuroimaging study that showed activation patterns in reading factual narratives that suggested an action-based reconstruction was elicited, whereas the brain areas involved in fiction reading suggested constructive simulation in line with the imagining potential of future events. This work supports a suggestion of Marr and Oatley that factual and fictional works orient readers to real-world interactions on the one hand and imaginative simulations on the other. Mangan and Kuiken's very suggestive study, Lost in an iPad, Narrative Engagement on Paper and Tablet, has some interesting implications for thinking about immersion and nonfiction, for they did find that nonfiction read on an iPad disrupted transportation, indirectly impeding empathy. Mangan and Kuiken also help us think about a question that appears more pressing as more and more reading migrates onto screens. Anne Mangan and Don Kuiken report that iPad readers experienced dislocation within the text and awkwardness handling the medium, regardless of their prior experience with electronic media. As I've just been discussing, the paratextual cue that indicated reading materials were nonfiction discouraged transportation, and in another part of the study, readers on paper were more likely to report a relationship between transportation and empathy. These are concerning findings if, as Robert Waxler and others fear, so much reading is moving on screen that key benefits of the reading experience may be lost. Waxler is an admirable character, one of the founders of the Changing Lives Through Literature program known as CLCT, which is an experimental alternative sentencing program that combats criminal recidivism through a course of literary reading and discussion. I'm a fan. However, when I read Waxler's recent book, The Risk of Reading: How Literature Helps Us to Understand Ourselves and the World, I was discomfited by his wholesale denunciation of digital reading. Waxler believes that, quote, "We are losing our sense of the central importance of linguistic narrative. The technologies creating the digital revolution devalue language and increasingly do away with boundaries, celebrating instead speed and boundless exhilaration. The visual trumps the linguistic, while the image and the screen trump the word and the book. As a result, we no longer seem to engage deeply with others or ourselves." If this were true, this would indeed be troubling. Since I'm a humanist, trained as so many of us were in concentrated self-scrutiny, I first considered those claims of Waxler's through introspection. I am a book-loving, book-buying, book-stacking reader, most at home with the codex, and especially for pleasure reading. Yet I also travel a lot, and because I'm a very fast reader, the Kindle was a godsend to me. I felt I ought to defend it and myself from Waxler's Jeremiad. I no longer need to travel with a sack of paperbacks. One as a backup will do me. Project Gutenberg is a treasure trove. You can get all the fairy books, a lot of early detective fiction, and virtually all of the Victorians for free. But is Kindle reading real reading? It is absolutely true that those of us with strong visual and spatial memories of words in the relation to the page, where they are on the page, will be discomfited by the lack of stability of the text as it appears screenful by screenful, though I would argue that as textual editors have always known, texts are less stable than we desire or remember anyway. Mangan and Kuiken persuasively demonstrate that readers using an iPad were less sure of their location in their reading than those in a booklet reading condition. And I agree with them that haptic and tactile feedback is likely to have an even higher impact on readers' locational sense when reading longer novels. But that particular difference does not impede my own immersion. Waxler argues that deep reading is threatened by electronic delivery systems, and Mangan and Kuiken's results support that contention. I, however, have a very strong, vivid impression of Elizabeth von Arnim's Enchanted April, the very first book I ever read on a Kindle. The characters and place live on in my mind, and I even have a strong impression of embedded texts in that novel, such as a newspaper advertisement and letters that the characters exchange within the book. Of course, I have also read forgettable junk on my Kindle, and I have abandoned books half read there, but the same can be said for the hundreds, maybe thousands of paperbacks and library books that have passed through my hands. It really isn't all Ulysses all the time, in my reading or in anybody else's reading. The Kindle is an excellent brown paper wrapper. You can read anything on it in public. Who is to know whether that is War and Peace or 50 Shades of Grey that you're clicking away at on the airplane? As a teacher, I've stuck with book orders of real physical books that students can write in, but I commend ebooks to the students who trace motifs with much greater alacrity than when they can get a Google book or use Amazon's Search Inside This Book feature. It's just simpler to collect that data than rereading the whole thing. And searchable text isn't the only advantage of ebooks. Literacy happens on screen now for many children. My own kid learned to read through a combination of Arthur's Reading Race, which is a video game on the computer, Bob books, and those are little pamphlets that are physical, and Yu-Gi-Oh cards. The Yu-Gi-Oh cards sealed the deal. They were collectible items, but he would pore over them and I would buy him more. Before we engage in fruitless prohibitions and interdictions that will only make the content that we hope to confine to the codex obsolete by virtue of its medium, we should understand better the many interactions of technology and reading and avoid the pitfalls of generational old fogeyism. I know parents whose middle-aged school kids have grown up, whose middle school-aged kids have grown up reading on Kindles, and when I talk to those kids about the books that they've been reading that way, they seem fundamentally no different to me than we were with our stacks of Dell paperbacks, boggling at the what-if worlds and luridly fascinated by the differences of experience out there beyond the curfews and the boundaries. That is to say, fiction is still doing its work in the world. So I remain a medium agnostic with more questions than certainties. That said, we should still inquire. How important is the modality of reading to both immersion and empathy? Does our empathetic reading experience change when we shift from codex to e-reader to interactive screen? A literature review of this area reveals contradictory findings. Some researchers have suggested that screen reading results in shorter amounts of time spent reading, reduced comprehension or retention of detail, and have speculated that these diminishments could then also affect the level of empathy felt for characters in a story. This is research that's been made well known through the book The Shallows. Yet the Columbia Journalism Review and the George T. Delacorte Center for Magazine Journalism at Columbia University Graduate School of Journalism conducted a research project over the past year to explore magazine readers' empathetic responses to stories in print versus screens. This research isn't published quite yet, but it's on its way out. They had 65 study subjects read the same magazine story in either print or online. They used self-report questionnaires to test if there were any differences in the level of the details that the readers remembered and how emotionally engaged they had been. They found no differences in people's empathic responses to the story. Contrary to the findings of other academic research, subjects in the two groups remembered the same level of details from the story. Subjects in one group were no more likely to feel a similarity between themselves and the story protagonists or to be more emotionally moved by any one part of the story or the story overall. How about that? So maybe on-screen reading could be okay. Certainly, I had an immersive and strongly empathetic reading experience when I read the New York Times story by John Branch called Snowfall. It was a story about an avalanche at Tunnel Creek. And it had a combination of narrative, imagery, graphs, maps, and videos of some of the survivors talking that intensified my immersion, my empathy, and my retention of a vivid artwork in the genre of digital journalism. So we should take care. There are many more questions that we can ask about empathy and screen reading. There's an influential school of thought advanced by David Mile and his collaborators that a slowed reading pace indicates a greater likelihood of empathic responding. Does screen reading change readers' natural reading pace? I go really, really fast on my Kindle, so I think it's possible, impelling them to go faster or even to skim. Does faster reading indeed indicate reduced empathy? If so, could a restoration of a slower pace through voluntary settings or some sort of technological interaction like the sensors on exercise bikes or a kind of speed bump restore empathic levels? What if all the hypertext features were stripped out of e-texts? The notation features, the dictionary lookups, the hyperlinks. Would a less distracting reading experience more effectively invite immersion and empathy? I think that last tactic might actually work. To go about answering the big questions about the impact of fiction reading and of liberal education more generally, we humanists should welcome the assistance of our colleagues in the social sciences. Our introspection and observations from small samples can and should inform the framing of those questions. I applaud the collaborations between and among humanists and neuroscientists, cognitive scientists, and experts in discourse processing and the psychology of narrative impact, so many of whom are in this room. But we also need big studies with lots of research subjects and longitudinal studies that follow individuals throughout their lives. An example of the kind of research design that might help us understand the impact of liberal education on students' attitudes is being undertaken by the Ideals Survey, a 4-year study of 100,000 students focusing on attitude change. Sponsored by the National Initiative for Leadership and Institutional Effectiveness at NC State, the Interfaith Diversity Experiences and Attitudes Longitudinal Survey, that spells ideals when you take the first words, seeks to better understand student encounters with religious and spiritual diversity across the spectrum of American higher education. So their topic sounds slightly different. Among the changes it hopes to measure, though, would be growth in appreciative attitudes towards different worldviews, goodwill towards others of different worldviews, appreciation of worldview commonalities and differences, and global citizenship. Note that these are some of the same outcomes that various scholars have attributed to experiences of narrative empathy in literary fiction reading. Indeed, we have evidence from small-scale studies that some components of attitude change, bias reduction, and extension of the empathetic circle can come, at least in the short term, from reading fiction with a sympathetic orientation towards an outgroup. The Ideals study intends to consider both input variables, that is, pre-college expectations and perceptions and worldview identification, and environmental variables such as the campus culture, interfaith engagement, and curricular and co-curricular experiences. This is valuable because it should allow some conclusions to be made about the interactions of influences and the relative impact of stronger and weaker impulsions. Exposure to the humanities and opportunities to experience narrative empathy through immersion reading may emerge as strong drivers of attitude change, or, as I suspect, they may play a supporting role in steering emerging adults' development with stronger impulsions coming from their peers and influential people around them. To place the impact of the humanities, empathy, and our immersion fiction reading in this broader context of influences is not to denigrate or diminish its role. I believe that the worlds of fiction belong in the daily lives of liberally educated people, not only because they provide us with safe rehearsal spaces for intellectual risk-taking and entrees into societies that we could never otherwise visit. They exercise our skills of mental visualizing, cultivate our empathy and sympathy, and cement us into communities of fellow readers. Novels introduce us to universals of experience in spite of every kind of human difference. They connect virtually every desirable outcome of liberal education with pleasure, with mental refreshment, and with a time away from the pressures and demands of the real world. Allowing oneself to get lost in a book, immersed in a story, engrossed in the circumstances and fate of a fictional character, paradoxically links us with our kin, by which I mean only all the rest of those unique storytelling animals, humankind. And if recognition of our blessings and responsibilities as people among other people who share this world with us can start when we are lost in a book, then just think what we can do when we put that book down. Thanks.